Picture a bathhouse in the city of Córdoba in southern Spain, sometime around the year 4 BC. The air inside is thick with steam. Outside, the streets hum with the noise of a prosperous Roman provincial town. Merchants calling their wares, wagon wheels grinding over stone, children chasing each other through the narrow lanes between whitewashed buildings. Somewhere in the city, in the comfortable house of a Roman official named Lucius Annaeus Seneca the Elder, a baby has just been born. The child is small and by all accounts sickly from his earliest days. He will spend much of his childhood struggling to breathe. His family will worry about him constantly. Nobody looking at this frail infant could possibly have imagined what he would become. Nobody would have guessed that this boy, born on the outer edge of the Roman world in a provincial city in what is now Andalusia, would one day write words that would be copied by monks in medieval monasteries, translated by Renaissance scholars, quoted by French essayists, studied by Enlightenment philosophers, and read with genuine wonder in university classrooms more than 2,000 years after his death. Nobody would have predicted that he would become the most powerful man in Rome who was not technically in charge of Rome, or that he would die in a bathtub, bleeding slowly, dictating philosophy to his secretaries until the very end. Tonight, we are going to follow the life of Lucius Annaeus Seneca, known to history simply as Seneca the Younger. We are going to trace his journey from that provincial nursery in Spain to the corridors of imperial power in Rome. We are going to sit with him in exile on a windswept Atlantic island. We are going to watch him navigate the treacherous world of Nero's court, where one wrong word could mean death and the right friendship could mean everything. And we are going to encounter the ideas he left behind, ideas about how to live, how to face fear, how to spend your time, how to think about death, that remain as urgent and as alive today as they were when he first wrote them down. This is a story about one of the most fascinating and contradictory figures in all of history. A man who wrote movingly about the dangers of wealth while living in extraordinary luxury. A man who counselled calm in the face of tyranny while serving a tyrant. A man who spent his life preparing for death and, when death finally came for him, met it with a composure that astonished everyone who witnessed it. So settle in, let the world outside go quiet, and let us begin. To understand Seneca, you need to understand the world that made him, because it was a world of dizzying extremes. The Roman Empire in the early 1st century AD was, by almost any measure, the most powerful political entity that had ever existed. It stretched from the windswept coasts of northern Britain to the sun-baked deserts of Egypt, from the Atlantic shores of Portugal to the banks of the Euphrates River in what is now Iraq. Its roads connected cities that had never been connected before. Its armies enforced a peace, the famous Pax Romana, across territories that had known centuries of warfare. Its merchants traded in silk from China, spices from India, grain from North Africa, and glass from Syria. But this vast empire was also a place of terrifying instability at its very top. The emperors who sat on the throne of Rome held power that was essentially unlimited, and the consequences of that unlimited power depended entirely on the character of the person holding it. Rome in Seneca's lifetime would be governed by men who ranged from the merely difficult to the genuinely monstrous. The empire's wealth and sophistication existed in constant, uneasy tension with its capacity for sudden, arbitrary violence. For a man as intelligent and as prominent as Seneca would become, this tension was not an abstract political observation. It was the basic condition of his daily life. Seneca's father was a man of considerable learning and ambition. Seneca the Elder was a teacher of rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking, and he was devoted to his craft with the intensity of someone who understood that words were the currency of Roman public life. He had 3 sons. The eldest, Novatus, would become a Roman governor. The youngest, Mela, would become the father of the poet Lucan, and the middle son, the frail and brilliant Lucius, would become Seneca. The father brought his family to Rome while Seneca was still young, understanding that if his sons were to make something of themselves, they needed to be where the action was. Rome itself was an extraordinary city. By the time Seneca arrived as a child, it was home to something approaching 1 million people, a fact that strains comprehension when you consider that the second largest city in the world at that moment probably had fewer than 100,000 inhabitants. The streets of Rome were dense and noisy and frequently dangerous. The apartment blocks, called insulae, rose to astonishing heights and periodically collapsed. The streets flooded during heavy rains and baked in the summer sun. Wealthy Romans lived in extraordinary luxury, while the urban poor scraped by on grain doles and the charity of patrons. Into this city came the young Seneca, already fighting his lungs, already searching for something that could make sense of the world he found himself in. And what he found, in the lecture halls and private homes where Roman intellectual life was conducted, was philosophy. Philosophy in the ancient world was not the academic discipline it has largely become today, a thing studied in universities and published in journals and argued about by specialists. In Rome, philosophy was a way of life. It was a set of practical tools for living well, for managing emotion, for facing adversity, for understanding your place in the order of things. And of all the philosophical schools available to a young Roman intellectual in the 1st century AD, the one that would claim Seneca most completely was Stoicism. Stoicism had been founded roughly 3 centuries before Seneca's birth in Athens by a man named Zeno of Citium. Zeno had arrived in Athens after being shipwrecked, losing all his cargo and his livelihood in a single catastrophic moment, and had stumbled into a bookshop where he began reading Socrates. Struck by the ideas he encountered, he found a philosopher named Crates and asked to become his student. The story goes that Crates led Zeno through the marketplace carrying a pot of lentil soup, which spilled and ran down his legs, and that Zeno endured this humiliation without complaint. He had found his school. Zeno and his followers met in a public space in Athens called the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, and it was from this meeting place that their philosophy took its name. The Stoics believed that the universe was governed by a rational principle they called the Logos, a kind of divine reason that permeated all things. Human beings, uniquely among all the animals, were capable of participating in this reason. This capacity for reason was not just our defining characteristic, it was our highest obligation. To live according to reason was, for the Stoics, to live virtuously, and to live virtuously was the only genuine path to happiness. This sounds abstract, but the Stoics were fundamentally practical people, and the implications they drew from these premises were concrete and powerful. If virtue is the only genuine good, then everything else, wealth, health, reputation, pleasure, even life itself, is what they called a preferred indifferent. These things are fine to have and reasonable to prefer, but they are not what makes a life genuinely good. A person who has virtue and nothing else is living well. A person who has everything except virtue is not. This distinction, radical in its simplicity, had enormous consequences for how the Stoics approached the challenges of daily life. The young Seneca absorbed these ideas with the hunger of someone who has finally found the language to describe something he had always felt but could not quite express. His chronic illness had already taught him something important: that the body cannot be fully controlled, that suffering arrives without asking permission, that the things we hold most tightly can be taken from us without warning. Stoicism offered a framework for understanding this reality not as a problem to be solved, but as a condition to be accepted and navigated with grace. He studied under several teachers. One in particular, a man named Attalus, left a mark on him that lasted his entire life. Decades later, Seneca would write that he remembered rushing to Attalus's lectures before they began, not wanting to miss a single word and lingering long after the other students had left. Attalus taught him that philosophy was not a hobby or an intellectual ornament. It was a discipline of transformation, a daily practice of reshaping the self. Seneca, whose health was constantly threatening to unravel his life, needed exactly this kind of teaching. Attalus was a man of fierce personal conviction. He lived simply, ate simply, owned little, and had no interest in the social performances of Roman respectability. He demonstrated, by the example of his own life, that the Stoic argument about wealth and comfort was not just an intellectual position, but a livable one. Seneca watched this and took note. He would struggle with the lesson for the rest of his life, never quite managing the simplicity his teacher embodied, but never quite forgetting it either. The gap between Attalus's life and his own would become one of the productive tensions that kept his philosophy honest and his writing alive with genuine human difficulty. He also studied under a philosopher named Sotion of Alexandria, who introduced him to the Pythagorean practice of vegetarianism. For about a year, Seneca gave up eating meat entirely, finding in the practice a kind of clarity and lightness that he valued. His father, the old rhetorician, eventually persuaded him to stop, apparently worried that the habit would attract suspicion in an era when certain foreign religious and philosophical practices were being associated with political dissidents. Seneca complied, with what seems like genuine reluctance. He ate meat again for the rest of his life, but the experience left him with a sensitivity to food and consumption, and the relationship between physical habits and mental clarity that surfaces throughout his later writing. Another teacher, a man named Fabianus Papirius, was a bridge figure between philosophy and rhetoric, someone who could speak beautifully about serious ideas and who demonstrated that the two were not in conflict. From him, Seneca absorbed the sense that good philosophical writing should be graceful, that the effort to think clearly and the effort to write well were not competing impulses, but the same impulse expressed in different registers. The philosopher who cannot make his ideas comprehensible to people who are not already philosophers has, in some important sense, failed. Ideas that stay inside the academy are not doing the work that ideas are supposed to do. These teachers, taken together, shaped something in Seneca that no single influence could have produced on its own. From Attalus, he took the discipline and the insistence that philosophy was practice, not theory. From Sotion, he took the sensitivity to the relationship between body and mind. From Fabianus, he took the literary ambition. And from all of them, he took the core Stoic conviction that the examined life was not just philosophically preferable, but practically necessary, that a person who did not reflect on how they were living was not really living at all, but simply being carried along by circumstances, reacting to events without ever quite understanding them. His lungs, which had troubled him since childhood, became a serious crisis in his early adult years. The exact condition is uncertain, but ancient descriptions suggest something like tuberculosis or possibly chronic asthma or both. There were periods when Seneca struggled to breathe at all, when each breath was a small battle, when lying down made things worse and getting up was agony. He wrote later, with characteristic candor, that he had contemplated suicide during these dark periods. The thought was not dramatic or despairing so much as rational. He was in pain. He could not see it ending. What, exactly, was the point of continuing? What held him back, he said, was not courage exactly. It was his father. The old man was already elderly, already frail himself, and Seneca knew that losing a son in this way would destroy him. So he stayed. He endured, and the endurance itself became a kind of education. Seneca would spend the rest of his life writing about the relationship between suffering and wisdom, and he would never write about it as a theoretical matter. He knew what it felt like to lie awake at night, wondering if you would survive until morning. He knew what it felt like to watch the healthy world going about its business while you sat on the margins, watching, waiting, fighting for air. His doctors and his family eventually sent him to Egypt for his health. His aunt was married to the prefect of Egypt, one of the most powerful positions in the Roman Empire, and under her care, Seneca spent several years in Alexandria and along the Nile. The warm, dry air of Egypt was considered therapeutic for lung conditions, and it seems to have helped. He recovered, he read, he rested, he thought, and when he finally returned to Rome, somewhere around the year 31 AD, he was leaner and quieter than he had been, but also more focused. He had been through something, he had come out the other side, and he was ready to begin his public life in earnest. Rome in the 30s. AD was the Rome of the Emperor Tiberius, Augustus's morose and reclusive successor, who had retreated to the island of Capri and governed the empire from a distance through a network of informers and a ruthless prefect named Sejanus. It was a city of suspicion, where accusations of treason could destroy a family overnight and where the wrong word in the wrong company could be fatal. Navigating it successfully required intelligence, discretion, and a kind of social radar that allowed you to read rooms accurately and speak precisely. Seneca proved to have all of these qualities. he began to build a reputation as an extraordinary writer and speaker. His early philosophical essays and letters began to circulate among Rome's educated classes, and people who read them were struck by something that was genuinely rare. A writer who combined deep intellectual substance with prose so vivid and precise that reading him felt like being talked to directly, intimately, by someone who understood your actual experience of the world. He entered the Senate. He began to practice law. He attracted powerful patrons, and he attracted, perhaps inevitably, powerful enemies. Caligula, who succeeded Tiberius in 37 AD, and whose early popularity would curdle terrifyingly into megalomania, reportedly came close to having Seneca executed, supposedly on the grounds that his oratory was too brilliant, which in the paranoid atmosphere of the time was apparently reason enough to feel threatened. Seneca was spared, the story goes, because one of Caligula's favorites convinced the emperor that Seneca was so ill he would die soon anyway. This was an uncomfortable kind of salvation, but Seneca was pragmatic enough to accept it. The reign of Claudius, who followed Caligula, brought a different kind of catastrophe. Claudius's third wife, the formidable and ruthless Messalina, accused Seneca of having an affair with Julia Livilla, a niece of the emperor. The charge may have been false. It may have been part of a political maneuver designed to remove potential rivals. Whatever the truth, the consequences were real. In the year 41 AD, Seneca was condemned to death by the Senate. Claudius commuted the sentence to exile, and Seneca was shipped off to Corsica. Corsica in the 1st century AD was not the Mediterranean holiday destination it would become in later centuries. It was a rugged, sparsely populated island of mountains and scrubland, sitting in the western Mediterranean just north of Sardinia, and it was used by Rome precisely because of its remoteness. People sent to Corsica were meant to feel forgotten, cut off from everything that had made their lives meaningful. Seneca spent 8 years there, 8 years away from Rome, from his friends, from the intellectual life that sustained him, from his career, from any prospect of advancement or even ordinary engagement with the world. He was, by any external measure, finished. He was in his early 40s, which in the Roman world was already the middle of a man's later years. He had no obvious path back to relevance. The island was not without its own harsh beauty. The mountains rose steeply from the coast, covered in dense scrubland that the local people called the maquis, a tangle of rosemary and lavender and cistus that gave off a powerful fragrance in the summer heat. The sea around the island was extraordinarily clear, a deep green blue that changed color with the weather and the time of day. The local population, which spoke its own language and had its own customs, regarded the various exiles who washed up on their shores with a mixture of curiosity and indifference. They had seen Romans before. They would see more. Seneca found the place uncomfortable, the climate alien, the food strange, the culture opaque. He complained about it in his writing with a directness that suggests the complaints were genuine rather than literary. But he also, in the way that sensitive and intelligent people sometimes do when placed in extreme circumstances, found that the discomfort was a kind of gift. In Rome, surrounded by friends and obligations and the constant stimulus of urban life, a certain kind of deep thinking is simply unavailable. The mind is always partially occupied, always half listening for something, always aware of the social texture of its surroundings. In Corsica, stripped of all of that, Seneca had no choice but to go inward. And going inward, he discovered, was where the real work was. What he did in those 8 years was write. He wrote philosophy. He wrote essays. He wrote tragedies, elaborate verse dramas based on Greek originals, full of tyrants and gods and suffering and the terrible consequences of passion untempered by reason. He wrote letters to friends back in Rome. He observed the natural world around him, the movement of the sea, the behavior of birds, the way light changed over the mountains in different seasons. And he thought, with the extended, sustained concentration that is only available to someone who has nothing else to do. The tragedies he wrote during this period are fascinating documents, often overlooked in favor of his philosophical prose, but essential to understanding him fully. They are dark, relentlessly dark, full of characters who cannot master their own destructive impulses, who are consumed by lust and revenge and the abuse of power. Medea, Phaedra, Thyestes, Oedipus, Hercules in his madness. These are stories of catastrophic failure, of the human capacity for self-destruction, told with a dramatic intensity that suggests Seneca was not just exercising his literary muscles, but working through something real. The tyranny he had experienced, the arbitrary violence of imperial power, the terrible things that happened when passion overthrew reason in the minds of powerful people. All of this found its way into the tragedies, displaced into myth but recognizably present. The works from this period are marked by something that his later, more powerful writings sometimes struggle to maintain: a quality of genuine vulnerability. He was not advising emperors or managing the affairs of the world's most powerful state. He was a man sitting on a rock at the edge of the known world, working out how to keep his interior life intact when everything external had been stripped away. He was, in a very literal sense, living the philosophy he had spent his youth studying, and the philosophy was holding. He wrote about exile itself, composing consolations addressed to his mother and to a friend, arguing that the wise man carries his true home within himself and that no geographical displacement can touch what is genuinely important. These were not just rhetorical exercises. He was talking himself through something genuinely painful, using the tools of philosophy the way you might use a splint on a broken bone. Not to pretend the injury isn't there, but to hold things stable while healing happens. He also wrote, more uncomfortably, a series of flattering pieces addressed to powerful figures in Rome, trying to engineer his own recall. He wrote a long consolation to Polybius, a powerful freedman in Claudius's household, praising him in terms so excessive that later scholars found them embarrassing. Seneca himself seems to have been embarrassed by them. He never republished these works and was notably reticent about discussing this period of his career. But this too is part of his story. The philosopher who knew what was right and who was capable of compromising it when his own survival felt genuinely uncertain. He was human. He was frightened. He wanted to come home. His recall came not from Claudius, but from Claudius's new wife, the extraordinary Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina had survived the court of Caligula, had been exiled herself, and had come back to Rome with the focus of someone who had been to the edge and intended never to go back. She married her uncle Claudius in 49 AD in a union that shocked even Romans who were accustomed to extraordinary things, and she immediately began maneuvering her son from a previous marriage into position as the emperor's heir. Her son's name was Nero. Agrippina wanted Seneca back in Rome for a specific purpose. She needed a tutor for Nero, and she needed that tutor to be a man of unimpeachable intellectual reputation, someone whose presence would give the boy's education a gloss of culture and philosophy that would make him seem suitable to rule. Seneca was recalled from Corsica and installed as the prince's teacher. He was also appointed to a political position that gave him standing in Rome. He'd been away for 8 years. He returned to find that the world had changed around him while he had stayed, in certain essential ways, the same. Nero was 12 when Seneca began teaching him. The boy was complicated from the start. He had genuine artistic instincts. He loved music and poetry and theatre. He had a quick intelligence that responded warmly to intellectual stimulation. He also had a mother who was managing every aspect of his existence with a degree of control that would have been damaging to anyone and was particularly dangerous applied to a child who would one day have unlimited power. Seneca saw all of this and understood, with the clarity of someone who had spent years thinking about the relationship between character and circumstance, that what happened to this boy in these formative years would have consequences that stretched far beyond the palace. He taught Nero rhetoric, philosophy, governance, history. He tried to instill in him the Stoic values that he himself had spent a lifetime working to internalize. That power was a responsibility rather than a privilege, that the mark of a great ruler was self-restraint rather than self-indulgence, that how you treated the people beneath you was a better measure of your character than how you treated your equals. Whether Nero absorbed any of this, and how much, is one of the most debated questions in ancient history. The answer, as we shall see, is complicated. Claudius died in 54 AD. He was almost certainly poisoned, and the most likely poisoner was Agrippina, who had decided the moment was right. Nero, 16 years old, became emperor, and Seneca, along with a military man named Sextus Afranius Burrus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard, became the effective ruler of the Roman Empire. This is not an exaggeration. The first 5 years of Nero's reign were so well governed that they were later called the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5-year golden age of Nero, and ancient historians attributed this quality of governance almost entirely to the influence of Seneca and Burrus. They drafted the young emperor's speeches. They shaped his policy. They managed the Senate with skill and relative restraint. They kept the empire's administration honest and its frontiers secure. They also, it must be said, kept the more dangerous aspects of Nero's personality temporarily in check. Seneca was writing during these years with extraordinary productivity. The essays and letters and dialogues that would become the foundation of his lasting reputation were pouring out of him alongside all the demands of governing the world's largest empire. He wrote about anger, producing a long essay arguing that rage was never useful and always destructive, that the loss of self-control was a kind of madness that made the person experiencing it not more powerful, but more helpless. He wrote about the shortness of life, arguing that most people waste their time so comprehensively that they effectively experience a life far shorter than its biological length, and that the remedy was not to live longer, but to be present and deliberate in how you used the time you had. He wrote about the happy life, about friendship, about peace of mind, about providence, about the steadiness of the wise person in the face of fortune's reversals. These essays have a quality that is very hard to define but very easy to recognize. They sound like someone talking to you, not at you, not performing wisdom from a great height, but actually sitting across from you and working something out together. There is a warmth in Seneca's prose, an attentiveness to the actual difficulties of human experience that is entirely his own, and that distinguishes him sharply from most of the philosophical writing that survives from the ancient world. And yet, while he was writing all of this, while he was advising an emperor and managing the machinery of Roman government, Seneca was also accumulating personal wealth on a scale that was frankly staggering. Ancient sources suggest that at the height of his power, he was one of the wealthiest private individuals in the empire. He owned villas across Italy. He had art collections. He lent money at interest on a scale large enough to generate genuine resentment, particularly in Britain, where his aggressive loan-calling may have contributed to the rebellion led by the Queen Boudica in 60 AD. He dined off silver. He travelled in comfort. He was, in almost every measurable external way, the opposite of what his philosophy recommended. This is the central contradiction of Seneca's life, the thing that both troubled his contemporaries and has fascinated every reader ever since. He knew it himself, and he addressed it with a directness that was either admirably honest or conveniently self-justifying, depending on how charitably you read him. He argued that the wise man could live among luxury without being corrupted by it, that what mattered was the interior relationship with possessions rather than their presence or absence. He distinguished between enjoying wealth and depending on it. He said that the test of whether you were enslaved to your possessions was how you would feel if they were taken away, and that he himself could walk away from all of it tomorrow without distress. Maybe he could. We cannot know. What we do know is that he never actually walked away from it, not voluntarily, not while the choice was his to make. And this gap between the philosophy and the life would follow him to the end. Of all the works Seneca produced, none has proved more enduring than a collection he began writing in the final years of his life, a series of letters addressed to a friend named Lucilius. Lucilius was a real person, a younger man of equestrian rank who had administrative responsibilities in Sicily and who was genuinely interested in philosophy. The letters are real letters, in the sense that they were actually sent and received and replied to. But they are also literary compositions, shaped with extraordinary care, intended to be read by a wider audience. There are 124 of these letters that survive, and they cover an astonishing range of topics. Seneca writes about how to deal with a crowd, about the merits of travel, about the value of manual labor, about old age, about friendship, about the proper attitude toward one's servants, about why we fear death, about how to read philosophy, about the relationship between theory and practice, about the nature of time, about how to begin each day, about what happens when we die. The letters are remarkable for their intimacy. They feel like windows into an actual mind at work, a mind of great range and depth and honesty, circling around questions that it cannot entirely resolve but refuses to leave alone. Seneca begins many of them with a detail from his own daily life, something that happened that morning, something he observed walking through the city, something he read that made him think. He then uses this small moment as a door into larger questions, moving from the particular to the universal with an ease that never feels forced. He writes about time with an urgency that has never lost its power. Vindica te tibi, he tells Lucilius. Reclaim yourself for yourself. He describes how time is stolen from us, some of it by others, some of it by circumstances, and a very great deal of it by ourselves, by our own distraction and procrastination and refusal to be present to the life we are actually living. This is not a complaint about busy schedules. It is something deeper, a recognition that most of us are only partially alive, that we drift through our days half-present, planning for a future that may never arrive, regretting a past that cannot be changed, and missing the only thing that is actually real. This moment, right now. He writes about friendship with equal depth. For Seneca, friendship was not a social convenience or a pleasant addition to life. It was one of the primary goods, one of the things that made life genuinely worth living. But he was careful to distinguish between real friendship and its many counterfeits. Real friendship, he argued, required you to trust another person completely, to share everything with them, to be as open with them as you are with yourself. Most of what passes for friendship in public life is something much thinner. Mutual advantage, pleasant company, the comfort of being liked by someone who matters. These things are fine in their place, but they are not friendship, and confusing them for it leaves you lonely in a very particular way, surrounded by people and entirely alone. He writes about death with a directness that modern readers often find startling. Every letter is a meditation on mortality, he says, and he means this literally. He thinks about death every day, not morbidly, not with dread, but as a practice, as a way of staying honest about what matters. He quotes Epicurus, his philosophical opponent, but also, clearly, a writer he loved. Let us go to our sleep with joy and gladness. And he argues that the person who has learned to think about death properly, who has made peace with the fact that their time is limited and their end is certain, is paradoxically the freest person alive, because they are no longer vulnerable to the threats that govern everyone else's behavior. While Seneca was writing letters about wisdom and freedom, the world around him was darkening. Nero, freed from the stabilizing influence of Burrus, who died in 62 AD of a throat ailment, was becoming something very different from the promising young emperor of his early years. The artist and aesthete had always been in tension with the emperor, and now the emperor was winning. Or rather, something worse than either of them was winning. Nero killed his mother Agrippina in 59 AD. He had wanted to be rid of her controlling presence for years, and when the opportunity arose, he arranged for her murder with a thoroughness that left no room for ambiguity. The ancient sources describe an elaborate attempt to sink a rigged ship with her on board, which she survived by swimming to shore, and then a straightforward sending of assassins to finish the job. When they arrived, Agrippina reportedly bared her abdomen and told them to strike the womb that had produced such a son. What Seneca's role was in all of this is one of the most uncomfortable questions in his biography. He did not prevent the murder. He could not have prevented it in all likelihood without sacrificing his own life. But what he did do was write, on Nero's behalf, the letter that was sent to the Senate explaining and justifying what had happened. This letter, described by the historian Tacitus with barely concealed horror, was a piece of political spin that would be recognizable in any era. It cast Agrippina as a traitor who had been plotting against the emperor's life and whose death was regrettable but necessary. Seneca wrote it. The philosopher, who had spent decades arguing for integrity and self-knowledge, put his extraordinary literary gifts in service of a lie told on behalf of a man who had just murdered his own mother. Nero then killed his first wife, Octavia. He was becoming openly dissolute, appearing on public stages to sing and act, which was considered deeply undignified for an emperor. He was surrounding himself with flattering companions who encouraged his excesses rather than tempering them. The government of the empire, which had functioned well under Seneca and Burrus, was now in the hands of a man named Tigellinus, a deeply unpleasant figure who understood that what Nero wanted was permission rather than guidance, and who was happy to provide it. Seneca saw all of this. He could read the direction of travel as clearly as anyone. He made several attempts to withdraw from court, citing his age and his health and his desire to return to a quieter life. Nero refused each request with what reads, in the ancient sources, as a kind of menacing affection. He could not quite let Seneca go. The philosopher's presence at court gave the emperor a respectability that was becoming harder and harder to maintain by other means. And Seneca knew, with the clarity of someone who has spent a lifetime thinking about freedom and constraint, that he was trapped. The Stoic tradition that Seneca had spent his life studying and writing about placed enormous emphasis on the quality it called courage, or more specifically, the quality of facing adversity and death with equanimity. The Stoics believed, and Seneca had argued extensively, that death was not an evil. It was simply the end of a finite thing. What mattered was not the length of life, but its quality, its depth, its alignment with virtue. A life of 100 years lived without self-examination was worth less than a day lived with genuine wisdom and integrity. These were not just words, they were claims about how to live, and the Stoics understood that the test of any philosophical commitment is what happens when it is seriously challenged. Seneca knew this. He had written about it repeatedly. He had argued that the Stoic sage should be able to face catastrophe with the same composure that ordinary people bring to mild inconveniences. He had even, in various ways, practiced this. His illness had been practice. His exile had been practice. His years of navigating the dangerous proximity to power had been practice. But there was one final examination coming, and he could feel it approaching. In 65 AD, a conspiracy against Nero was uncovered. The Pisonian conspiracy, named after the senator Gaius Calpurnius Piso, who was to have replaced Nero on the throne, involved a significant number of prominent Romans, senators, military officers, and members of the Praetorian Guard. The conspiracy was betrayed before it could be acted upon, and Nero's response was a wave of executions and forced suicides that swept through the Roman aristocracy like a scythe. Seneca was implicated, though historians still debate how serious his involvement actually was. He denied any part in the conspiracy when questioned. He may have been telling the truth. He may have had knowledge of it and withheld it. He may have hoped for its success without actively participating. In any case, it did not matter. Nero did not need a legal conviction. He needed a reason, and the conspiracy provided one. An officer was sent to Seneca's villa with the emperor's orders. Seneca was at dinner when the officer arrived. He had his wife, Pompeia Paulina, with him, and several friends. He received the message with composure, which surprised everyone present. He asked, apparently, that he be allowed to change his will. This was refused. He then turned to his friends, who were weeping, and told them to stop. Where, he asked them, were the teachings of philosophy? Where were the precepts they had built up together over so many years against exactly this kind of moment? Had they imagined that the storm of fortune, when it finally came, would spare any of them? He had known for a long time that Nero was capable of this. Youth and power were always a dangerous combination, and Nero, who had killed his own mother, was not a man who would hesitate long at the killing of a former teacher. Nero had given him, Seneca said, what any philosopher might wish for: the chance to die well. He opened his veins at his arms. The blood came slowly. He was old, and his body, which had been fighting him in various ways since childhood, did not cooperate efficiently even now. He asked for poison, the same hemlock that had killed Socrates, but it had no effect. His friends also opened their veins in an act of solidarity that was partly loyalty and partly its own kind of philosophical statement. His wife tried to die with him, but soldiers stopped her at Nero's orders, apparently unwilling to have quite so many deaths on his hands at once. Seneca, bleeding from his arms and legs and not dying with anything like the speed that might have made things simpler, was carried to a steam bath where the heat was meant to help the blood flow. He continued talking throughout. He continued dictating. He called for his secretaries and spoke to them, according to Tacitus, in words that he intended to be preserved for posterity, though these specific words were not recorded. He was, to the very end, a man for whom thought and expression were so fundamental to his identity that even dying could not interrupt them. He did not last long enough in the steam. He was moved to a bath of hot water and submerged. He died there. He was around 68 or 69 years old. The year was 65 AD, and the manner of his death, reported in vivid detail by Tacitus, became immediately one of the most famous deaths in the ancient world. One of Seneca's works that tends to get overlooked in the modern focus on his personal philosophy is a massive project he undertook late in his life, a scientific encyclopedia he called the Naturales Questiones, the Natural Questions. It is 7 books of sustained inquiry into the natural world: lightning and thunder, earthquakes, rivers, winds, snow and hail, comets, the nature of water and fire. He observed the world around him with the same intensity he brought to the observation of human behavior, and he brought the same intellectual honesty to both. What is remarkable about the natural questions is not its scientific accuracy, which is sometimes excellent and sometimes wildly wrong by modern standards, but the quality of mind it reveals. Seneca genuinely wanted to understand how things worked. He was not content to accept received explanations when those explanations did not hold up to scrutiny. He challenged authorities, including Aristotle, on specific points where observation seemed to contradict theory. He proposed explanations for natural phenomena that are sometimes surprisingly close to what we now know to be true. His discussion of the relationship between earthquakes and underground water, for instance, anticipates ideas that would not be properly understood for many centuries. He also used the natural questions as he used everything as an occasion for philosophy. Observing the grandeur and complexity of the natural world, he argued, was a form of moral and spiritual education. The person who looks up at the sky and sees only weather is missing something that the person who looks up and wonders about the mechanics of the cosmos and their place within it has access to. Curiosity, genuine intellectual curiosity, was for Seneca a virtue in the full Stoic sense, a way of aligning the mind with the rational order of the universe. To ask how things work was to participate, however humbly, in the same logos that ran through all of creation. He was particularly fascinated by comets. They appeared unpredictably, blazed across the sky for weeks, and then vanished. Most Romans regarded them as omens, portents of the deaths of kings or the fall of dynasties. Seneca was skeptical of this interpretation in a way that was genuinely unusual for his time. He argued that comets were natural phenomena with natural explanations, and that the fact that we did not yet understand those explanations was no reason to attribute them to supernatural meaning. He predicted, with what turned out to be extraordinary accuracy, that future generations would understand comets properly and would look back on the superstitions of his era with the same gentle condescension that we bring to the beliefs of any age that has been superseded by knowledge. This is Seneca at his most appealing, confident enough in reason to challenge the received wisdom of his culture, humble enough about his own limitations to frame his knowledge as provisional, and generous enough toward future generations to imagine that they would do better than he could. It is the attitude of a genuine intellectual, someone who is in love with the process of inquiry rather than attached to any particular conclusion. Of all the ideas Seneca left behind, perhaps none is more immediately relevant to the way we live now than his thoughts on time. The modern world is in many ways a world of stolen time, stolen by notifications and obligations, by the compulsive checking of things that do not need checking, by the passive consumption of other people's lives. Seneca would have recognized all of this instantly, even if the specific technologies would have baffled him. He wrote that we are not short of time. We waste it. There is a difference between these two things, and the difference matters. A person who genuinely lacked time would be a victim of circumstances, and there would be nothing to do except endure the shortage. But a person who wastes time is making choices, even if those choices are largely unconscious, even if they feel like the absence of choices rather than their presence. The cure for wasted time is not more efficiency, but more attention, a deliberate turning toward the question of what you actually value and whether how you spend your days reflects that value. He describes, with a vividness that has not aged at all, the way we put off the things that matter until some future moment that never quite arrives. We tell ourselves we will be present when the children are older, when the project is finished, when things calm down. We make plans for the life we will live once our actual life has resolved itself into something more convenient. And then, one day, we discover that we have used up the time without ever quite getting to the part where we were going to start living properly. This is not cynicism. Seneca is not telling us that life is hopeless or that happiness is impossible. He is telling us that it is possible right now, in this moment, under these exact circumstances, if we are willing to stop waiting for the circumstances to change. The present moment, he argues, is the only time we actually have. The past is fixed. The future is uncertain. Only now is available to us, and the person who understands this lives with an abundance that no amount of wealth or success can manufacture. Seneca thought about death every day, and he was not embarrassed about this. He thought about it not as a morbid obsession, but as a practical tool for living well. He argued that the person who has genuinely confronted the reality of their own mortality, who has sat with the knowledge that their time is limited and their end is certain, is thereby liberated from a vast range of fears that otherwise constrain human behavior. Most of us, he observed, live in a kind of low-level terror of death that we never quite acknowledge or examine. This unexamined terror shapes our choices in ways we do not understand. We pursue wealth because we imagine it will protect us from the vulnerability that is the real thing we are afraid of. We seek status because we imagine it will make us matter in a way that death cannot diminish. We fill our days with distraction because the alternative is to sit quietly with the knowledge that we are mortal, and that knowledge, unexamined, feels unbearable. But the Stoic practice of meditating on mortality, which has the rather alarming Latin name memento mori, is not designed to make us miserable. It is designed to do the opposite. When you genuinely accept that you will die, not as an abstract fact, but as an experienced reality, something remarkable happens. The things that seemed enormously important begin to settle into their actual proportions. The petty grievances, the status competitions, the accumulation of things you do not need for reasons you have never examined, all of these begin to look like what they are: ways of filling time that could be spent on something real. He wrote that the wise person lives each day as though it might be their last, not in a state of panic, but in a state of attention. Not scrabbling desperately for experiences, but simply paying full attention to whatever is actually happening. The food on the table, the conversation with a friend, the light coming through a window. The fact of being alive in a world that is, if you look at it properly, extraordinary in every direction. He also wrote, with the particular authority of someone who had genuinely come close to dying on multiple occasions, that the anticipation of death is almost always worse than death itself. We construct elaborate internal theatrical productions about the moment of our dying, the pain that might precede it, the loss of consciousness, the darkness that follows. We rehearse these productions repeatedly, often without quite realizing we are doing so, in the background anxiety that colors many people's experience of daily life. And what all this rehearsal costs us, Seneca argues, is the thing it is supposedly protecting, the life that is actually available to us right now, while we are still here to live it. He did not pretend that dying was pleasant or that the approach of death carried no difficulty. He was too honest for that kind of pastoral comfort, but he argued that most of the suffering associated with death is generated not by death itself, but by the imagination of death, by the stories we tell ourselves in advance. The dying, in his experience and observation, tended to go quietly. The dying moment was rarely the agonized drama we imagine it to be. It was, more often, a gradual release, a loosening of the grip on everything that had previously seemed so important. What made death difficult was not the moment of dying, but all the moments leading up to it. The long anticipation, the dread that infected the years and days and hours before the end arrived. The Stoic practice of negative visualization, which Seneca describes and recommends throughout his letters, is designed precisely to address this. It involves deliberately imagining the loss of the things you value most: your health, your relationships, your freedom, your life. Not in order to make yourself miserable, but in order to do the opposite. The person who has genuinely imagined losing what they have is paradoxically more capable of appreciating it. They move through their day with a quality of attention and gratitude that the person who takes everything for granted simply cannot access. They hold their blessings lightly enough to enjoy them fully, rather than clutching them so tightly that the clutching itself becomes a kind of suffering. Seneca's three-book essay on anger, De Ira, is one of the longest sustained philosophical treatments of a single emotion in all of ancient literature, and it remains one of the most remarkable. He was motivated to write it partly by observation and partly by self-knowledge. He had a temper. He knew he had a temper, and he spent a long time thinking about why anger was so seductive and so destructive, and what could actually be done about it. His central argument is this: anger is never useful. Never. Not even in situations where it seems like the right response. Not even when you have been genuinely wronged. Not even when injustice demands a response. This is a stronger position than most people take, and Seneca knows it. He anticipates the objection immediately. Surely there are situations where anger is appropriate, where the sight of evil or cruelty or injustice should make a good person angry. He says no. The good person acts against evil not because they are angry, but because it is right to act. The anger adds nothing to the action and generally makes it worse. What anger does, he argues, is take the person experiencing it out of the position of power and into a position of weakness. You believe, when you are angry, that your anger is an expression of your strength, your refusal to accept what has been done to you. But what anger actually does is hand control of your interior state to whoever or whatever provoked it. The person who has offended you is now, in a very real sense, running your mind. Every time you replay the offense, every time you fantasize about revenge, every time the memory of what was done to you causes your heart to clench with rage, you are giving that person a continued power over you that they have not earned and do not deserve. The Stoic alternative is not passivity. It is not absorbing injustice without response. It is responding from a position of clarity rather than heat, with the full force of your intelligence and your will, without handing the steering wheel of your mind to someone who is not qualified to drive it. Seneca's thinking about friendship goes somewhere that most of us, if we are honest, recognize as true, even if we have never quite articulated it. He distinguishes between people we are friendly with and people we are actually friends with, and he suggests that the gap between these categories is wider than we tend to admit. We have many acquaintances, many pleasant relationships, many people we enjoy spending time with. We have very few genuine friends, people with whom we share our actual interior lives, people to whom we would tell the truth even when the truth is uncomfortable, people whose welfare matters to us as much as our own. He argues that a true friend is someone you can be completely yourself with, in a way that you cannot be with most people, because most relationships require some degree of performance. You present a version of yourself calibrated to the context, to the expectations of the other person, to what is socially appropriate in that situation. This is not dishonesty exactly. It is just the normal management of social life. But it is also exhausting, and it keeps you at a certain distance from everyone you know. The rare gift of a relationship where this performance is not required, where you can speak your mind and show your actual self and know that you will still be accepted and valued. This is what Seneca means by friendship, and he treats it as one of the highest goods available to a human being. He also argues that you cannot have this kind of friendship without being genuinely trustworthy yourself, without being the kind of person who can receive another person's vulnerability without exploiting it. Friendship, in this view, is not found. It is built slowly through repeated demonstrations of integrity and care. No honest account of Seneca can avoid the contradictions, and no honest account should try. He was a man who wrote more beautifully about the worthlessness of wealth than almost anyone before or since, and who was extraordinarily wealthy. He wrote about the importance of political independence and spent years deeply embedded in the most dangerous court in the world. He wrote about honesty and drafted a letter justifying a matricide. He wrote about the courage to speak truth and remained silent when silence might have been the worst kind of cowardice. There are ways to defend him against some of these charges. His wealth, he argued, did not own him. His presence in Nero's court, he could argue, moderated the emperor's worst impulses for years, and his absence might have made things much worse much sooner. The letter about Agrippina was written by a man who had no real alternative beyond his own death. These defenses are not entirely without merit, but there is also something important in refusing to let him off the hook entirely, because Seneca himself would not let himself off the hook. He knew the contradictions were there. He wrote about them obliquely and not so obliquely, with an honesty that is actually quite rare in writers of any era. He did not pretend to be the wise man he described. He presented himself as a fellow traveler, someone who was working on the same problems his readers were working on, who had made some progress but remained imperfect, who was trying to do better and sometimes failing and trying again. This admission of imperfection, this refusal to claim a height he had not reached, is actually one of the most attractive things about him. Philosophy, he said, does not promise to produce a person who is already outside the range of human experience. It promises to help you make progress, to move you in the right direction, to give you better tools for navigating the inevitable difficulties of being alive. A philosopher who tells you they have solved the problem of being human is either lying or deluded. A philosopher who tells you that the problem is real and hard and worth working on every day, and who is visibly doing that work themselves, this is someone worth reading. Seneca died in 65 AD. The empire that had made and destroyed him would continue for another 4 centuries in the West and nearly 15 in the East. The language he wrote in would become a dead language, studied rather than spoken. The city that had been the center of everything would eventually be sacked and stripped and partially forgotten. The philosophical school he belonged to would be fragmented and dispersed and absorbed and partially reinvented by new traditions. And yet he survived all of it. His letters were copied by monks in medieval monasteries who found in them a moral seriousness that felt compatible with, and perhaps complementary to, their Christian faith. His essays were translated by Renaissance humanists who were hungry for classical models of how to live an examined life. Montaigne, the great French essayist, quoted him so frequently that he once joked that Seneca was always lurking somewhere in the room when he sat down to write. The Jesuit educators of the 16th and 17th centuries made him central to their curriculum. Descartes read him. Emerson read him. The Stoic revival of the 21st century, which has seen millions of people turning to ancient philosophy for practical guidance in navigating modern life, owes more to Seneca than to almost any other single figure. What is it about him that keeps drawing readers back across such vast distances of time and circumstance? Part of it is surely the prose, which is unlike almost anything else in ancient literature. He writes in short, punchy sentences that have the quality of aphorisms without the emptiness that most aphorisms eventually reveal. Each sentence lands with a weight that the next sentence then qualifies or extends or complicates. Reading him in Latin is apparently like being hit repeatedly with something that leaves no bruises. Reading him in good translation is only slightly less overwhelming. Quintilian, the great Roman teacher of rhetoric who wrote a generation after Seneca's death, was famously critical of his style, worrying that young people who read too much Seneca would pick up his verbal mannerisms without his depth of thought. This criticism is itself a kind of tribute. You do not worry about the influence of writers who are not widely read, and Seneca, by the time Quintilian was writing, was everywhere. His sentences were being copied and quoted and imitated across the literate world. His ideas were circulating in forms and contexts he could never have predicted. The early Christian writers found him particularly interesting. His emphasis on the inner life, on the primacy of virtue over external circumstance, on the importance of self-examination and the cultivation of the soul, resonated with Christian values in ways that felt sometimes uncanny. A legend grew up, almost certainly false, that Seneca had been in correspondence with the Apostle Paul, that the great Stoic and the great Christian had exchanged letters about ethics and God and the proper conduct of human life. The letters themselves, which still survive, are now universally agreed to be forgeries, probably composed in the 4th century. But the very fact that someone thought to forge them, thought it plausible that Seneca and Paul might have recognized something in each other worth discussing, tells you something important about where Seneca sat in the intellectual imagination of the late ancient world. The medieval period kept him alive through the monastery scriptoria, where monks copied his works not just because they were classical Latin and therefore valuable as linguistic models, but because the content seemed genuinely useful for the moral formation of the men and women living under the discipline of the rule. The themes Seneca returned to constantly: the management of desire, the cultivation of equanimity, the practice of self-examination, the acceptance of death, the proper use of time. These were not foreign to the monastic tradition. They were, in many ways, its daily business. Seneca, stripped of his specifically Stoic metaphysics and read through a Christian lens, became a kind of honorary monk, someone who had intuited, by the light of unaided reason, truths that faith could illuminate more fully. But it is the contemporary Stoic revival that has perhaps done the most to bring him to the widest modern audience. In the early 21st century, something remarkable happened. Philosophy, specifically Stoic philosophy, escaped the universities and began circulating among people who had no academic training and no particular interest in philosophical scholarship, but who were, in various ways, struggling with the pressures and uncertainties of modern life. Athletes and executives and soldiers and people going through illness or grief or loss began reading Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, and most of all, Seneca. They found in him what readers have always found: a voice that speaks directly to the experience of being human in difficult circumstances, with warmth and intelligence and complete absence of condescension. But it is not just the style, it is the subjects. The questions he was working on are the same questions we are working on, because they are not historical questions. They are human questions. What should I do with my time? How should I relate to the people I love? What should I do about the anger that flares up in me and makes me act in ways I later regret? How should I think about the fact that I am going to die? What is actually worth wanting? What is success, really, when you strip away the social performance of it? These questions do not age. They do not become obsolete. And Seneca's answers, even where they are partial and imperfect and complicated by his own contradictions, have more real content than almost anything written on these subjects in the 2,000 years since. The final letters in the collection to Lucilius have a quality that is different from the earlier ones. There is less of the playful circling, the careful building of an argument from a small observed detail. There is more directness, more urgency, a sense of someone who has less time than they used to have and wants to make sure what matters most gets said. He writes about the relationship between philosophy and daily life. He writes about the importance of not deferring the business of becoming better, of not telling yourself you will take wisdom seriously when conditions are more favorable, when you are less busy, when the urgency of immediate concerns has passed. The urgency of immediate concerns, he says, never passes. If you wait for perfect conditions to begin the work of self-improvement, you will wait forever, and the self that needed improving will have run out of time without ever having been addressed. He writes about what it means to be useful, not in the narrow sense of performing a social function, but in the deeper sense of contributing something real to the people around you, of leaving them better than you found them. He had influenced an emperor, for better and for worse. He had written works that were already being read across the empire. He had mentored and advised and argued with and consoled more people than he could count. He was, by any reasonable measure, useful. And yet the question nagged at him, as it nags at anyone who takes seriously the gap between what they have done and what they could have done, between who they are and who they might be. He writes about peace, the peace that comes not from the resolution of external problems, but from a settled relationship with your own mind, from having worked through enough of the fear and the anger and the grasping anxiety that normally fills the space behind your eyes to find something quieter underneath. He does not claim to have found this peace definitively. He claims to be looking for it, to have found glimpses of it, to believe that it is real and available and worth spending your life pursuing. And then the letters stop. Not because Seneca ran out of things to say, not because Lucilius stopped writing back. They stop because Seneca stopped, in the way that all human things eventually stop, in the steam bath of a villa outside Rome, surrounded by his secretaries, still talking, still thinking, still turning the great questions over in his mind until there was no more mind to turn them with. He left behind more than 100 essays and dialogues and letters that have survived intact, plus tragedies, plus a satirical work about the death of Claudius, plus fragments and references to works that have not survived. He left behind a way of writing that influenced European literature for centuries. He left behind a set of ideas about how to live that have helped an incalculable number of people navigate the difficulties of their particular moment. He left behind, finally, a death that he would have recognized as consistent with everything he had argued for. He was not a perfect Stoic. He was not a perfect anything. He was a man of extraordinary intelligence and genuine moral seriousness who lived in extremely difficult circumstances and did some things well and some things badly and thought harder about all of it than almost anyone else. He was, in other words, recognizably human in a way that makes his company across 2,000 years of time feel not like a history lesson, but like a conversation. And conversations, the best ones, the ones that matter, never really end. Thanks for listening. Good night and sleep well.